Welcome, Illtud. Many thanks. Do I pronounce your first name correctly? It's Welsh.
Perfect.
Perfect. Well, that's high praise from a Welsh. Not bad. So, many thanks indeed, Illtud, for taking the time to join us here at the GDI. Highly appreciated. To kick this off, maybe could you take us through the process of producing cellular meat? I mean, it's a topic that has been covered by earlier conferences we had here at the GDI, but just as a reminder, so to say, possibly in a way so even a dummy like me understands, a cultured meat for dummies. So to say.
In the simplest of terms, take a cell from an animal, directly from an animal, and feed a series of nutrients to that cell so that it multiplies in the same way that cells would in the body. And those nutrients would represent the same as what we would feed to an animal. So in the case of a cow, whether that's forage in form of grass or grain, and then the mass of cells that are grown can then be processed by the food industry using traditional processes that already exist to make food products that we would hope are as nutritionally bioavailable as traditional meats.
And I suppose it's muscle cells, is that right?
Well, it can be anything, actually. It can be any sort of cell origin. So it could be a fat, it could be a muscle, it could be skin cell. But I mean, the key focus, really, meat is complex. If we talk about meat and its replica,
it's not only muscle.
It's not only muscle, but ultimately it depends on what it is that we want. So fat, for instance, adds a huge amount of flavor in food. Muscle obviously has the kind of key amino acids and the protein quality. So it's dependent, really. A number of the questions have been asked today in terms of, what are we looking at? What are the key facets in terms of health are we looking for, or are we purely looking for ingredients for flavor?
You're a farmer, you are into cultured meat, so there must be benefits. What are the benefits of cultured meat? Also, well, I don't call it lab-grown anymore, as you grow it in your barn. Well, probably not as I imagine it, slightly romantically, possibly. Go ahead, benefits of cellular meat.
So I think there's a number of speakers have mentioned today about the burden of agriculture and how we produce food currently. And so it's sort of an overproduction and an overconsumption of food and a huge amount of waste. So we're also faced with this challenge of producing more protein for a growing world population. So we need more tools in that particular toolbox. Cultivated meat is one, and if we compare it directly to industrialized production of something like cattle, then there are some major challenges in how we currently produce that protein. Cultured meat has some benefits in terms of land use and in terms of water use and greenhouse gas emissions.
Tom McMillan from the Royal Agricultural University in the UK said that cellular meat technology is in an early stage enough that it still might be shaped, also in terms of its connection to farming. To me it was quite new, to be honest, that you have farmers, or you try to interest the farmers into the cellular meat business. Would you mind to elaborate that it's still in an early enough stage?
So there are still fundamental challenges in the production of cultivated meat. There are some great scientific leaps that still need to be made for us to see that.
Just one example, if it's not too.
Well, just it's the scaling of it yet.
Okay.
We don't have the technology yet. We don't have the nutrient formulation that is the finalized one that we will use to feed the cells. We may not even have that original cell population designed specifically for a food product yet. So scale is very different from market entry, and in understanding that kind of period. But I think from my perspective, and I share Tom's view in that as a farmer coming into a new industry, what kind of blew my mind was that here was a technology that was being suggested that replaced agriculture, but the feedstocks and those inputs, that starting cell, those feedstocks that you feed the cell, ultimately are primary agricultural products and therefore are wholly reliant on traditional agriculture. And yes, there are alternatives. We can look at precision fermentation and ways in which to feed those cells with alternatives. But actually, if we start thinking more logically, more with a kind of an engineering brain perhaps, do we have enough stainless steel in the world to build these bioreactors? Possibly not. Do we have, how much energy does it take to run reactors to produce, through precision fermentation, produce the nutrients to feed cells? Actually, the best idea is to grow plants, and for those plants to feed the cells. So we're replicating what is traditionally happening with a cow.
If my own research has been right, there's a quote by, you're going to be blown away now, Winston Churchill, who once said, and you've been blown away by his quote, he said in the 30s, he said, "We will escape the absurdity of growing a whole chicken in order to eat the breast or wing by growing those parts separately." Winston Churchill, in the 30s. You were mesmerized by this quote, but coming from a traditional farm, going back 300 years, you must have been conflicted as well.
Absolutely. So on reading that quote at the conference in Maastricht that you mentioned in 2015, it took me around 6 months to get my kind of agricultural brain around this notion. But at that time in the meat processing business that I had, we were working on carcass utilization. The idea if an animal is to die for food, then we must respect that process and to utilize every part of that carcass for food. And so much of that carcass at the moment goes off for further valorization, whether it's in blood or skin, bone, or fat, that is seen as waste. And that was my starting point. And that was the work that I was doing that time for many multinationals, looking at actually how they could extract more value from those carcasses, but also working in sort of slightly more high-end food industries. At the time, I was working with an American chef called Dan Barber, who was doing a residency in Selfridges in London, where 8,000 covers in his rooftop restaurant over a summer was purely from waste food. And so that was the focus of where I was at the time. And all of a sudden, here's a technology that can produce the single component that consumers actually want to consume. And that in itself was transformative. There was no need to find the value in waste. And so that's what struck me. But I actually found out last week that Churchill stole that quote. So
well, just doesn't come as a surprise to me when it comes to Winston. Yes? Where did he steal it from? Who did he steal it from?
From a friend and a contemporary who was actually a scientist. But he apparently, this was a social science conference last week that I attended, and there was a history of cultivated meat. And in it, it went back into the roots of science fiction in the 19th century. But seemingly, his friend had also stolen it from someone else. So there's a trail there that goes back.
And we have to be grateful to Winston to bring it into the world, even to today's conference at the GDI. You mentioned just a second ago multinationals. Why do you think it makes sense for farmers? Farmers in the UK who've done, traditional, normal farming business so far, to get involved in the production of cellular meat. Sure, there are major food companies like Nestle, Mondelez, Danone, and so on. Why do you think it makes sense for ordinary farmers to get into this business?
So it's been referenced a couple of times about the protests at the moment. And I think some of the root in agricultural communities and the unrest sits in the fact that the majority of farmers are price takers as opposed to price makers. And so that in itself is difficult for an industry. And so Marta's point on subsidy, in the UK it's quite different at the moment. Post-Brexit, we're now looking at the production of public goods in terms of environmental land management as opposed to the production of food. So there's a real risk to the agriculture industry. It needs to change. But I think it comes back to the point of these inputs are agricultural. So the agricultural industry could, so the main source of nutrients, the main energy source within this nutrient formulation that you feed the cells is glucose. Currently that comes from corn, but it can come from any other sort of products. It could come from wheat. So if the agricultural industry doesn't mobilize, that will just remain. Global grain systems will remain as they are, and there will be no control in that. But the industry is early enough for there to be an opportunity to change. The same in terms of that initial cell population.
Do you actually think that the production of cellular meat on farms might be an advantage in countering prejudice or reluctance in terms of food culture, tradition, food DNA? So the meat still comes from the farm, so to say. Could you take advantage of that?
Definitely, I think that's the argument for that link to where our food comes from. And it's quite disparate at the moment. We don't really understand, because of an industrialized food system, we don't understand where our food comes from. Nevertheless, there is still a portion of society that still wants to go to a farmer's market to have that direct contact. So what food looks like in the future is actually within the realms of science fiction. Is it something that, like my coffee this morning came from an espresso machine? You know, are we going to see a kitchen-top appliance where potentially we're buying ourselves direct from the farmer's market because that's what we want? Or are we looking at producing on farm, or are we looking at traditional centralized systems? I mean, it's the same notion. In our business, we look at technology. We don't make food products. We're looking at the most efficient technology. And a project that we did last year was for the European Space Agency to look at astronaut nutrition for both the moon and travel to Mars, and how do we actually build those systems? So it's about multiple scales. It's about, you know, worktop factory, it's about shipping container factory, and where you then position that to access foods.
Of course, every medal has two sides, and the downside might be that it's some kind of a reception of farms involved in cultured meat production as laboratories rather than farms. Are you worried about that, or you think you can sort that out easily?
So interestingly, there's as part of the Tom McMillan, who leads a project at the Royal Ag at the moment on the opportunities and threats to UK agriculture from cultured meat. They did large-scale scoping of farming forums online and of social media that involved quite polarized voices, so generally negative language. Interestingly, over the last 3 or 4 years, the term lab has dropped right down the leaderboard in terms of its use.
All right.
And this is from a farming community, or specific actors within the farming community that are relatively opposed. And cultivate is the top term, cultured is the second. And so there's already a shift, and that in itself, although it's not an acknowledgement of acceptance, that's a softening in language, and language is important. Again, another point that's been made today, language is exceptionally important in how we talk about things and how then we make those kind of acceptances.
So would you say you're not, when you started, and you got started quite early, I mentioned the Agriculture Limited was 2016, right?
Yes,
Early
yep.
2016. 8 years later, I suppose you're not a unicorn anymore. How's it going?
Still a rarity from the farming community, and I think I've come from a background of looking at holistic food production, so I wasn't just purely a farmer. I then moved from being, actually my early career was in the film industry, which is something completely different, but I came from a sense of, I had a better sense of consumerism that I was able to bring into my traditional farming business, and so I guess there was a different approach for me. But I'm not the singular person anymore. And I also felt that the agricultural community needed a voice within new innovations to make it relevant for multiple ones. And so I decided not to stand on the sidelines and scream, but actually be part of the conversation.
Not standing at a sideline and scream. But what about your family? I'd love to mention it again. You're going back 300 years in the farming business, your family, the Dunsfords.
Yeah.
What about your family? Are you the black sheep?
Not necessarily the black sheep, but I don't think they quite understand it. Because and actually it comes back to one of Marta's points about tradition. You know, that's the problem, is that moniker. So we've existed on the same farm since parish records exist, which is 300 years. So it's significantly longer than that, but I can't put a mark on that. But tradition is a burden in that respect, because there's an expectation of you to carry on to do something. And for that reason, sometimes you're not doing things for the good of the planet or for the good of your society. And I guess there's a slight braveness to be able to kind of break that cycle. So they aren't opposed to it, it's just they don't necessarily fully understand it.
Well, that's something you might have the same situation in a wider perspective, I suppose. It probably reminds you of what you encounter in the broader public then. Ladies and gentlemen, you are supposed to ask questions as well, and he will be ever so happy to answer them. So, again, any questions to Illtud Dunsford from Wales? Again, you've been crystal clear. Well, I've got some more. Oh, no, you're just scratching your head, sir? No question. So, there is one. Here we go. There are actually 2 microphones coming your way now.
Okay. It's a stupid question, but...
There are no stupid questions.
Yeah, maybe, sure. The cells that you are using to create then this cellular food, how did you get it? Can, in the future, this meat be called vegetarian or vegan? As a vegan, no, because maybe. But do you have to kill something to create it? Or in the future, are there some method to have it non-killing?
So this is a really interesting moral question as well. So so no, you don't have to kill an animal. You can take a biopsy from an animal. However, in a European and in a British context, that's a unnecessary medical intervention for an animal. And therefore, there's a moral question there that questions why should you put that animal under that level of stress. In other cultures, it's not. So it comes back to this cultural point. So in North America, it's perfectly fine. It's seen completely acceptable to take that biopsy. In terms of our business, we don't produce food, so we're cell agnostic, so we have cells from multiple types. But actually, a lot of what we collect is actually directly from the abattoir after the kill process. So it's a byproduct of the agricultural industry for us.
All right, thank you. I think there's another question here. All right. You're warming up to Illtud. Excellent.
Yeah, my question was regarding, I mean, first of all, I admire the project. How implementable you think it is in terms of like the knowledge transfer that would need to happen for, let's say, the ordinary farmer who is not a scientist to implement something like that on their farm? Would it be like just an eccentric hobby of a few, or would it be something that could actually really roll out? And then also, I guess, the question of finance comes into it. Like, would you see this as a kind of business partnership with food processors, retailers that finance it, or like do farmers have to again go in the advance?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess so there are a couple of different research projects that are happening at the moment. The one I mentioned in the UK that's being led by the RIU, that specifically looked at a few different farm scenarios and what that business might look like. And our contribution to that particular project was looking at techno-economic analysis to see whether it was viable on farm. So there's a viability financially for that. Obviously, there's a high capital to make that initial investment. But on the point of so the specialization of running a process, the comparison that was made during that project was actually looking at things like cheese production on farm and yogurt or something like that. So actually you're already using large stainless steel vessels to produce something. So there is some, but I should also reference there's a project in the Netherlands called Respect Farms. They're specifically in much more detail looking at this opportunity and actually designing a model that then can be replicated elsewhere across Europe to be able to produce an on-farm model.
Thank you for that. I think right in the back there's a question.
Yes, I will go with Mr. Dunsford because I cannot pronounce your first name. But thank you very much for sharing your thought, very inspirational. I have a question regarding the productivity of this new technology. We know that today the agrarland worldwide, 80% of the agrarland is used to produce feed for animals. And we also know that this machine taking those calories and proteins in through a cow to us human is not very efficient. Now, if I hear you right, we still need to produce, but instead of going through the cow, it will go into these big tanks. Can you give a number that indicates, going through the tank, how much more productive is this agrarland we have at hand to feed the world?
Yep. Yeah. So I'll reference academic research that's been done in life cycle analysis. Dr. Hanna Tuomisto from the University of Helsinki has been doing life cycle analysis since 2011, and she's iterated her kind of research looking at this. So the most recent published statistics in 2022, I think, that comparison was with extensive beef production, a 90% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, 50% reduction in water use, and a 50% reduction in land use. In comparison with producing a kilo equivalent of beef through an extensive method, which is kind of quite important to say that if we were to look at intensive production, it would be significantly better again.
There is one more question, I think. Oh, no, you're going for it now. Guys, we just take this one question. You staying with us for the rest of the conference?
Absolutely.
You know where to find.
All right, thank you very much. Very interesting talk. I have one question, and how would you remain the nutrient life cycle when there's no manure to bring out back on the fields?
Actually, that's a really great question. So ammonia is one of the outputs from the bioprocess system. So you can actually valorize that and put that back into as a fertilizer. So the two key kind of waste streams from the process. One is lactate, which you can then turn into polylactate products, so it's forms of plastic. And the other one is ammonia. So in terms of what we do as a company, it's on technology. So anything that's designed has to have both the life cycle analysis in mind in terms of making it better than what we're trying to mimic, but also that we can utilize those outputs. So the first ever theoretical factory that we designed was actually more efficient in producing lactate than it was in producing meat. So, but that's the challenge, is to actually sort of switch that to make it so efficient for meat.
Very good question indeed. You've got a farming background? Food tech. A very knowledgeable food technician here we have. All right, I think we did. Just one last question to you. If my again research, which is obviously only half right, we found out so far, you tasted cellular meat yourself in 2017, right?
Yes, that was the first time.
How did it taste?
So that's the reason why I exited my previous meat business and moved into this. It was so I came from a business where our main profitability was in developing food products for others. And so I would have said that one of my skills is eating, and you can prove that by that. But I think of myself as being a very good person that can actually taste. And that there was, going back to the point we discussed at dinner with Martin and I last night about food memories, that's what kind of got me, was that first sort of burst of umami in that tasting gave me the sense that I was actually eating meat. It wasn't like a mimic, like a plant-based product. It really was, because it contained cells that had the same, would allow the same response. And for me, if that could cement it for me, that was reason enough for me to concentrate my time in this industry to further that.
That, ladies and gentlemen, coming from a farmer whose family's farming roots date back 300 years. Illtud Dunsford, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for your time. You've been excellent. Thank you so much. Your applause. Many thanks.